So hello, it's a pleasure to be with you here to share this presentation. This is actually a re-recording of the presentation because a technical glitch meant that the live event wasn't recorded. So in the live event, Dr. Vasiliou was kind enough to introduce me, but I am going to introduce myself here. So very pleased to be with you to bring this presentation entitled #Surgeons2 at the blunt end of the scalpel. My name is Kate Bligh. I immigrated to Quebec from London in the UK 26 years ago. So I've been a settler here for 26 years now. I'm a communications consultant in life, and I'm a certified executive coach. I work with a number of people, including physicians, as a coach. I'm a lecturer, a part-time lecturer at Concordia University in the departments of English, Irish Studies, and theatre. I have an MFA in theatre directing, so my background has been as a theatre director for a large part of my life. I have an artistic practice based on intercultural and bilingual productions. More recently, I've been working as a trainer and a facilitator in the area of communications, and very specifically in the area of anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion training. So I've been doing consulting work with surgical foundations for the last decade. So in 2012, Dr. Vasiliou was kind enough to invite me to begin providing training during boot camp for the R1's residents. And so I began giving various trainings relating to communications, and then these expanded to role play training in areas such as giving bad news, cultural sensitivity, team building, all that kind of stuff. And more recently, I'm now providing these trainings with PGME. So I have been, during the pandemic, I've been giving online trainings in constructive feedback, skillful communication, and cultural sensitivity. And it's my privilege and pleasure to continue providing those sessions this year. And also with surgical foundations, we evolved a session which we called Aftermath, which was very small group sessions focusing on self-care and personal recovery for residents following traumatic events at work and devastating cases, which is an aspect of the work that I've been doing with the MHC, which I have to say I'm pretty proud of and attached to. So in another capacity, I have actually been participating in a research project that's being undertaken for SAGES. So it's a committee, I don't know the full title, I'm afraid, but they're addressing surgeon welfare and well-being. And they asked me to conduct interviews with a wide range of established surgeons. So a whole group of different genders, different races, different places in life, surgeons from their mid-20s to their early 60s. So I held long, extensive interviews with them, one-on-one for an hour each time, regarding their resiliency strategies, how they lead balanced, fulfilling lives in the face of also being an engaged surgeon, and also the difficulties they face at work, and sometimes their experience of burnout. So it was really my privilege. It's been my privilege to engage in this work, and the transcripts of those interviews are now being analysed, and I'm excited to see what the results will be. But I will be speaking a little bit to my experience in those interviews during this presentation. And I should just add, by way of finalising this introduction, that I'm also, apart from all of my various activities, I'm a former very grateful surgical patient at the Montreal General. So I underwent a colonic resection there in 2012, a very successful one, I'm happy to say. And I will be speaking to burnout in this session. So I am a recovered person who has had burnout, which came on in 2011 and took me a number of years to recover from, but I'm very happy to report that it is possible to bounce back from that too. So I will now proceed to introducing this presentation. So today I'm going to be sharing some observations from the training and the interviews that the trainings I give and the interviews I have been holding, both with residents and with surgeons. That's one of my purposes here. I'm just trying to play with the slides. There we go. So I'm going to consider, the stress and the trauma that you experience as surgeons, that the surgeons who I work with and have spoken to have reported to me experiencing, and some of the long-term impacts on you, both, that research tells us about and that they've reported to me on you and on your families and on your practice as physicians. And honestly, to share my concerns in that regard, because as I'm sure you're aware, it's pretty high. It's a very stressful job. And I am here also just to propose today, I'm a very practical person and I believe in action, some suggestions for and approaches to improving your outcomes and well-being. So these are really like personal steps you could take now. I understand that there's a lot of research to be done around this area, but as I'm going to suggest, a lot of research has been done, and things probably need to improve quite soon. So this is really a kind of an overview of what I'll be speaking to today. So as I was preparing this presentation last week, I was listening to the radio, and there was our health minister, Christian Dubé, on the radio explaining that he's planning an overhaul of the health system, and that health workers must never again have to deal with the stresses they have been through in the last 2 years. And this was on the CBC. And I, as I heard it, I imagined hollow laughter echoing through the corridors of all the hospitals in the province. Because really, honestly, well, my faith in a former accountant being able to fix the system is low. I have to honestly share that. But of course, I doubt all of you would have heard him saying that, because you're all far too busy to listen to the radio. You're always at work. So, however much great or little faith you place in the government, it's pretty clear that things really, truly do need to improve for you all in so many ways. Even before the pandemic hit, I could see that things were very stressful, and the pandemic has only served to kind of, put the spotlight on all of the stress points in the system and the stress points in your own lives. And of course, an upside of what we've all been through and what we're still going through is that change usually takes place at an accelerated level immediately following a major crisis, such as a pandemic. So, I'm anticipating some kind of a reset or some kind of addressing of the stresses that are involved. Even if it's not the government who will be doing it, I'm imagining that it'll be you, very capable people, undertaking these improvements yourself. So I'm speaking here today out of my concern and compassion for you and your experiences, not so much as you as surgeons, but actually you as human beings. So learning and growth, personal growth and positive change, and actually taking action to improve one's life is really at the heart of everything that I do as a communications expert and as a trainer and executive coach. So this is really where I'm speaking from today. So I am going to be touching on some difficult topics. And if that triggers you, I'll be speaking to that a little bit. I hope not too much. But I do hope to offer you, it is springtime, some cause for optimism and renewal, and maybe the feeling that some kind of positive change at the micro and at the macro level is actually within your reach. So I'd like to begin now by showing you a very basic coaching tool. So this is an exercise we call the Wheel of Life exercise. As you'll see, there's a circle which has been divided into 8 segments, and each segment corresponds with an aspect of life that probably we need to have some sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in if we're to be leading a balanced life. So as you see, the 8 segments are career, money, health, friends and family, significant other or romance, personal growth, fun and recreation, and physical environment. And so when I'm working with a client, this is a very useful kind of early basic diagnostic tool to see which bits of their life might be out of whack, which bits of their life are the ones that we might focus on together to enable them to make improvements there. And so I invite them to score their sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in these areas. And as you'll see, there's a scale here from 1 to 10. So they draw a kind of, a line across the dotted line that corresponds with the score out of 10 that they give to this particular aspect of their life. And then I'm going to show you now an example of a fairly typical wheel, right? The fairly typical result that a typical client might return to me with. So here you'll see that actually their relationship is in really pretty good shape, but their career and also their remuneration, this is not so much their investments. Life coaches aren't qualified to work with as investments, but just in terms of the income and the source of income, they're not too happy with that at all. So this kind of a result would indicate to me that those are probably the areas that the client might want to begin focusing on as soon as possible. And again, with the idea of giving them a more balanced life, of providing them with a kind of reset and improvement so that their experience of life isn't so lumpy or even like a flat tire. And then, in preparing this exercise, so I'm going to show you now an example of what I imagine the life balance of a great many of the surgeons that I have had the privilege to work with over the years might return to me. So very often, your careers are pretty impressive, pretty incredible, and you're very well remunerated for that. So career, money, and not areas areas that we need to work in, but almost all other areas might well be lacking. This is a fairly extreme example. And again, it's the example of a kind of flat tire of life. But specifically here, this person's physical environment and their sense of fun and recreation are just very, very neglected. And also the area of personal growth. So this is, where I would focus on immediately. But my proposal here is it could well be the life balance of a great many surgeons. And in fact, what a lot of people would do here is they would focus almost exclusively on their career and money to the detriment of all of these other considerations in life. And I witness a lot of surgeons doing this. And I honestly think that this is reflecting in them carrying a great deal of personal anguish. And that makes me sad. That gives me pause for thought. So, it's no news to you that surgeons lead tough, stressful, demanding lives. And it's no news to you that a lot of things can be out of balance. And as much as I'd prefer to not to, I am actually going to be speaking about burnout and stress a number of times in this presentation. So I'm just going to pass now to a few definitions. These are words that are tossed around, but I'm going to define them a little bit more precisely here. So what is burnout? Burnout includes loss of motivation, a feeling of being drained or exhausted all the time. That is, you have 1 or 2 good nights sleep and you still feel tired. Lacking a sense of satisfaction or accomplishment at work, having a sense of failure, difficulty sleeping, a change in sleep habits, withdrawing from co-workers, family members or friends. Again, it's very easy to bury yourself in your work and just feel awful while doing so. Feeling isolated or alone, being unusually irritable or impatient. This often happens in the accounts I'm receiving from you and your colleagues. Increased use of alcohol or drugs. And again, the statistics bear me out that this is the case. And then this is different, right? Burnout is different from stress. So here's a definition of what stress is: the responsibility to get something done without the resources with which to do so. Now, this can include the resources within the body of a patient you're working with. It could include the resources of time in the OR or specific pieces of equipment or specific team members, time in general, right? So there's a wide range of resources we can consider. But as soon as we feel we have a sense that we must do this thing and then we can't, we actually shift into a situation of stress, which activates our sympathetic nervous system. And this really begins to take its toll on our personal systems. So just to point out that people experiencing stress usually are confident things will get better eventually. And the difference here is that people in burnout lose this confidence, right? But people experiencing stress might also actually be hyperactive. They might actually ratchet up the amount of energy they're expending in order to try and deal with everything. And this, leads them on a very rapid path, unfortunately, towards kind of down the burnout slope, unfortunately. Now, I will say here, just to remind you, I've been conducting these interviews for SAGES with surgeons who are handpicked, really, because they apparently are leading happy, balanced, accomplished lives. These are, so they were chosen for that reason. Now, of the 14 I've interviewed so far in the last year, only one of them said they haven't experienced burnout. And these are the balanced, adjusted people. And these are mostly gastroenterologists, right? They mostly have happy, good, reasonable outcomes with their patients as well. They're not vascular surgeons or transplant surgeons dealing with really very, very, very poor prognoses with their patients. And this, of course, was all before the pandemic. This was the case. So I can only imagine what's happened now in the last couple of years with many of you. And I do feel I should refer back to this idea of a trigger warning, right? So some of what I'm talking about, it might be difficult. I might actually be touching on things that have been going on for you, but kind of bubbling under the surface, and you've just been getting by and moving through. And if this is the case, I do invite you, urge you very warmly to try and self-care around those feelings. Maybe it might be that it's actually time to reach out and talk to somebody or to solicit some kind of help or make some changes. Towards the end of this presentation, about the last third of it, I will be suggesting some very constructive recommendations for positive steps you can take in the short, medium and long term. And there will also be a whole bunch of links to support that you can reach out for if you're feeling that probably support might be a constructive thing to invite at this point in your life and career. So I'm going to move here. I'd like to speak a little bit about what I've witnessed, both in speaking with the established surgeons. When I say established surgeons, it's everybody above resident level, and also what the residents have told me over the last decade or so, and they have told me a great deal. ça va sans dire, as they say in French, but surgeons are incredible, fascinating, sensitive, perceptive, exceptional human beings, often very cultured in all kinds of ways, often highly talented beyond the area of surgery. I'm just, it's an astonishing privilege to be able to collaborate with you all to the extent that I do, really, and it does bear saying, because I think maybe this is sometimes forgotten. And my experience around the residents is they're just amazingly able young people. I also teach at Concordia University, so I often work with people in their 20s, and if I compare those students with the residents, I mean, they're just outstanding. Obviously, they're a little bit older, but outstandingly able young people, and it's very exciting to be along with them, supporting them, and witnessing their lives and their experiences and their learning. So I'd like to bring a couple of metaphors that I've come up with over the years for surgeons when I'm trying to explain them or speak to their conditions and how fairly unique they are. So one of the metaphors is that I compare surgeons to racehorses, right? So you receive extensive training, you're kind of rare, you only occur occasionally, you're very expensive to train and expensive to keep. But actually, in my observation, racehorses are often treated much better than a lot of surgeons, especially during their residency. All right, so, for instance, you bring them to a racetrack and they'll be provided with a really good stabling. But, surgeons being expected to be on call, the idea of you having a comfortable bed to sleep in or, healthy, nourishing food all night, it seems to be often out of reach and unavailable. So the stabling isn't so good. Or another analogy I've come up with is that and the surgeons have a lot in common with professional athletes. They really do. They're high performing. There's a lot of physical stamina, physical endurance involved. There's a great deal of complex training involved in bringing them to the high level of performance that they're at. The difference there being that a lot of professional athletes have a career that lasts maybe 15 years, and during that time, they will always be supported by an incredible team. So they will have a coach, they will have a physiotherapist, they will have a dietitian, they will have a psychologist, they will often have an agent or a manager. They will have all of those people, explicitly arranged around them, chosen for their skills in those areas. And again, in my observation, a lot of surgeons do not have anything like the same degree of support or skill as the elite athletes do. They often recruit a support team around them, and very often a great deal of support will come from their life partner and their families if those people are available, and which puts an incredible amount of stress on the marriages of physicians and surgeons, in my observation. So though that support can be there, but they're kind of cobbled together ad hoc, and there's a whole lot of support that could be more explicitly made available to surgeons, and I'll be speaking to that as we go along. And I'd like to bring now a third point here, which is this, that for all of how outstanding and elite and extraordinary you are, which you absolutely are, you're also party to and witnesses to human suffering and trauma on a daily basis, right? And only honestly, and we're seeing the effects of war at the moment in our news feeds, really at very close and shocking range at the moment from the Ukraine. This is not to diminish the other wars that are going on in the world, but I think a lot of us are deeply shocked and wondering about the long-lasting scars from what people are witnessing there. So obviously, surgeons aren't living through war, but they are witnessing the kind of suffering, over time, chronically, of human beings that is really only witnessed by people who have experienced war in their lives. So, the human beings around you don't witness anything like the same degree of trauma, of carnage and suffering that you do. So from the point of view of a layperson, a concerned, interested, invested layperson, you actually seem to go through hell, both in your training and what you witness in terms of other people's suffering for your patients, on behalf of your patients. And this is a situation which moves me deeply and is often not as explicitly as addressed as maybe it could be. So I'd like to bring a quote here now that I came across from a very funny book. I've been reading around the experience of physicians as a kind of support to the work that I've been providing over the years. And this is possibly the funniest book I think I've ever read in my life. And it just happened to be The Secret Diaries of a Junior Doctor, a book called This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay, who was an obs-gyn surgeon in the UK. In fact, his stress and distress in that occupation actually led him to leave medicine. This is a quote from towards the end of the book. So he suggests this: think about the toll the job takes on every healthcare professional at home and at work. Remember, they do an absolutely impossible job to the very best of their abilities. Your time in hospital may well hurt them a lot more than it hurts you, right? And it's these hurts which are often invisible, downplayed, overlooked, ignored by the system, or often compounded by the system, that really concern me, and is why I'm calling this presentation #Surgeons2, because it happens to you too as well. Just like the Me Too movement, a lot of people suddenly started saying, sexual abuse has happened to me. Well, clearly this is going on, and it kind of stands to be addressed more effectively than it has done historically. So I'm going to proceed now to a little anecdote, which I hope will illustrate, why it is that I've been observing these experiences so acutely, these experiences of yours so acutely over the years. So I'd like to speak to other people's perceptions of surgeons versus their own experience, the kind of objectivity, subjectivity thing, And, I've witnessed, and quite rightly so, surgeons are lauded, right? If you show up to a dinner party and somebody there is a surgeon, everybody will kind of be very impressed, as they should be. Surgeons are exceptional, outstanding people. And, they will elevate you. They will kind of put you on a pedestal in social terms. But the thing about being on a pedestal is that you also become increasingly out of reach, And so people tend to idolize you, put you on pedestals, put you up there, and then you'll find that people's ways of reaching out to you or speaking with you might actually shift simply as a result of your role in life, and that your humanity, your experience as a human being, often begins to be more and more overlooked. And there's this kind of disjunct between the human being you are and the incredible high level physician that you're functioning as, performing as in the world. And so here's my anecdote. So when I was in my 20s, I was actually working, before I became a director, I was working as a stage manager, and I was working at a very high level in English theatre in London, and I was working with some very, very famous people. So one of the famous actors I worked with at the time was this person. His name was Alan Bates. He's since passed on. So in the 1960s, he was a huge film star in the UK, kind of a British equivalent to Brad Pitt, if you will. I didn't meet him in the 60s. That was the decade I was born. But I was working with him in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. And by then, he was actually in his 60s. And I worked with him very closely for 3 weeks, because we were doing a play which was essentially a monologue. So he had 2 hours of text to learn, which is a lot of text. And I was running lines with him, working with him, enabling him to learn all of his lines in order to be able to do this incredible performance. So, it was he and I working alone, one-on-one for days at end. And one day, the publicity officer of the theatre came into rehearsal and said, we have a photographer here from a Sunday magazine. We'd like to do a publicity shoot, please, with you for the show. And he got very upset and agitated and sent the officer out of the room and asked me to close the door. And I turned around and realized he was trembling. And I was like, oh dear, what's the matter? And he said, do you have a mirror? Do you have a makeup mirror in your bag? Please. And I rooted around and pulled out my makeup mirror, and he whipped out a tube of mascara and started putting mascara on his eyebrows, which by now were white or gray. And he was terribly, terribly worried. Nobody warned him there'd be a photo shoot. And so he hadn't prepared himself to be beautiful enough for the photo shoot that he needed to be. And he was very, very anxious about being photographed as being old or older, or not the kind of matinee idol he'd been. And by the time he'd finished mascaring his eyebrows, it wasn't very successful. He kind of ended up looking a bit like this. He actually had tears in his eyes. He was so worried about how he was going to be perceived. And then he let the photographer come in and we had a shoot, but he was very comfortable all the way through it. And for me, this really took the blinkers off my eyes. I was a bit starstruck. I was working with this incredible film star actor. My mother was super impressed. We go out for lunch and people ask him for his autograph. And I suddenly noticed, so instead of just being impressed by him and overawed by his fame and his achievement, I suddenly noticed what it must be to be the human being that it was, what it must be to be vulnerable, to feel fragile, to feel sometimes exposed, to sometimes feel not at his 100% best, and also the terror of aging, because he needed to appear in a certain way and to function at a certain level in order to continue being Alan Bates. So this experience really triggered my concern for people who perform at a very high level, or people who occupy kind of high social status in the world. And subsequently, I've worked with political leaders. I've actually actually work with political leaders at the federal, provincial and municipal level. And I guess so with politicians, I've worked with company executives, CEOs, and of course with surgeons, noticing this disjunct between, how people are called upon to perform themselves as very significant entities, and then actually their needs as a human being, and seeing that how much their needs can be ignored or overlooked, and how vulnerable they can actually be in this position in this regard. So, since beginning my journey of consulting and training with the MUHC, what I've witnessed in terms of neglected needs, in terms of the kind of casual suffering of surgeons, both the older ones and the younger ones, it's actually moved me quite deeply. And sometimes, to be honest, it's really horrified me. So now I'm going to kind of get in a bit more deeply, and I'm going to share some of my takeaways from interviews with surgeons on behalf of SAGES, and also a few of my own observations of the surgical residents over the years. So here are some points that came out of the SAGES interviews. So, I spoke with several established surgeons who are really at the top of their game. They just can't wait to retire. And that struck me as being quite sad. And then I spoke with others who have actually basically moved out of the operating room. They're focusing on developing high-tech equipment. The system was just unbearable to them. The administrative load, the paperwork, just again got them to a point where they were going to flame out, or they were going to have to make a change. A lot of them, the majority of them, mentioned lack of personal agency as being the significant, most stressful condition within the system in which they're trying to function well. Or they'd say overwork and paperwork, which all of these kind of add up to the same thing. A number of the women surgeons explained in various different terms that being a woman in surgery is hell on earth, and that hell on earth term was the term that was used by one of them, certainly, and other ones said the same thing in kind of different ways. So really kind of shocking, surprising information that came from, again, these are people who are established, who externally seem to be doing just great, but this is some of their testimony. And then if I move on to some of my observations of the residents, at the R1 level, the really healthy ones, the happy ones who have great interpersonal skills, they can look, by week 3 of boot camp, or when they've begun, when they've done their second or third rotation, they can take on this look of kind of looking trapped or hunted, which is very concerning to me. And they've spoken to me about the stress of just dealing with their own basic needs as human beings. So, having a toothache, but just having no time to go to the dentist, or having to use their annual leave in order to get their teeth fixed, or, the shock of trying to manage juggle getting the tires changed on their cars, either in the spring or the autumn, in the fall, when actually they're on 24-hour rotation and there's no time, again, and having to take annual leave just to get basic things like this seen to, and it's being very, very stressful for them. And just to make the point of this, if you spend 100% of your waking life with the sympathetic nervous system activated all the time, not only being anxious about being residents because they don't actually know enough yet to feel that they can be confident, knowing that they're facing down, another exam after another exam, knowing that they're being yelled at often and criticized by attendings and staff and so forth, and fellows. All right, if this is your life, realistically, you are heading for trouble. All right, we know this from all kinds of research. All right, so when you don't belong to yourself, when your time isn't your own, it becomes all the harder to actually take care of yourself and to find the time to do that. So at some point it becomes much easier to care for other people than it is to care for yourself. And so this also, I would suggest, is the training that the system is providing to surgeons at the lowest, at the beginning of their careers. And if this is how you are trained to proceed, trained to comport yourself, then again, you're going to be heading for trouble some point down the line, not very far away. And then, of course, there are also residents with very particular needs. So, for instance, women from the Middle East, approximately 20 to 25% of the residents in surgical foundations are women from the Middle East. And I recently made the discovery that there are very acute needs that they're having, problems they're encountering, that I've only just discovered, and I've been working with them for 10, 11 years now. And other people in surgical foundations also had no idea that these were going on. It's only because there was an administrator who happens to speak Arabic, who therefore gained their confidence, who therefore was able to really speak to them and suddenly discover that these things are going on. So I hope we can take steps now to support them in these needs. But there's a lot that needs to be addressed. There's a lot that stands to be done, I would suggest. And I'd also like to speak. I like to speak now really to the culture of surgery, right? So I mentioned at the beginning I've done training in anti-racism and training in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in those areas we speak a great deal to this notion of culture, right? And that the culture kind of dictates how things have been for a long time and how they therefore are continuing to be. And it also dictates very largely, what's happening, what's being inflicted on individuals within the larger system. So the residents speak to me often about surgeons yelling or being angry with them, or yelling and being angry with people in the team in the operating room. And I will just share a comment that came to me in one of the SAGES interviews from a very senior surgeon in the US. I asked him if he ever felt, got to the point where he was yelling in the OR. And he made this really quite profound comment, I feel. He said, the people who yell are really focused on the problem, and the people who go quiet are really focused on the solution. And he said, I've learned that during my life. He said, but when I was younger, yes, I did yell, because honestly the people who trained me had been yelling, but I've actually learned in my process, in my arc, to actually get quiet and focus on the problem. It's a more constructive way of doing it, and I'm delighted and I celebrate for him that he was eventually able to learn that. But honestly, these are the kind of things that can be taught. They can be taught at the resident level, at the level of R1 and R2, and they can be addressed, and it will reduce the levels of stress for everybody, not just the surgeons, but everybody around them. And again, anybody who's yelling is actually at a terrible place of stress. They're suffering horribly if you're at the point of experiencing that much anger in the OR. So there's all kind of training and support that needs to be provided to it, towards those behaviors, and towards shifting them into more kind of humane, more appropriate ergonomic behaviors. And we can ask why is there this toleration of yelling and what I would call bullying, and if we look into the history of surgery, tracking it back, I know very early on in Europe, certainly the earliest surgeons were barbers, but then doctors practicing in the military were really the people who pioneered a lot of surgical practices and turned it into a separately recognized discipline. And why was it the military doctors? Well, because when you've got soldiers that you've just come through a war, they're so cut up and slashed up and damaged that you can operate on them anyway, because they're probably going to die, so it's worth taking the chance. And historically the bodies who weren't evidently so wounded wouldn't be operated on, because they'd pretty much die, it was guaranteed. So surgery has its roots in military behavior, and in all the doctors being not just doctors but also trained soldiers. And there's a whole training there of sucking it up, of standing and taking everything that the world can throw at you, and being in incredible pain and suffering, but carrying on regardless. And also the fact that yelling, and the fact that the idea of extreme hierarchy, and that people higher up the hierarchy can pretty much call the shots and do whatever they want to do, these are all behaviors that come to us via the military, and they're not necessarily constructive or useful. We have an umbrella term for this, and this is by no means that I wish to attack men, but the umbrella term for these behaviors has come to be known as toxic masculinity. And I just point out that toxic masculinity is as toxic and poisonous for the men who experience it as it is for everybody else, the other genders as well, that are being affected by it. So again, my point here is that the stress and trauma that you witness, and must accumulate over time, must be having an impact, right? And then a lot of people, and in the witness I've experienced, actually their response here is to keep themselves apart, right? To become very detached, to kind of shut down. And then unfortunately, if this is the response, then there's an even more of a chance that you actually won't be able to pay attention to your own emotional and physical needs, and also maybe those of your family. And again, this often impacts on family relationships, divorce, difficult family dynamics, all that kind of stuff. So, and unfortunately, we have evidence there's been a lot of research done. I'm just pulling up this comment from the senior surgeon I've already mentioned. There's been a lot of research coming out dating back to 1972 and even earlier, all right, that with burnout and surgeons, it's actually not so much a question of if you'll burn out, but when, which is really distressing. And the research shows us it's not just burnout, it's also that surgeons have infinitely higher levels of addiction, and unfortunately even of suicide, than of just about any of the other professions. This stress distresses me for all kinds of reasons, including a very personal one. That I have already needed a surgeon in my life, and I was very, very grateful for the treatment I received. It's entirely possible that I'll need another one again later in my life, and I'm uneasy with the idea of just how much other people are going to need to suffer in order to help be able to provide that service to me, in order to treat me in my hour of need. I'm really uneasy with the fact that it's normalized, that it's tolerated, and that it's been going on for so long. I'm uneasy with the accumulation of research literature, all right, that tells us very much so, it's been there since at least 1972, how difficult your lives can be. And so not just difficult, but actually a lot of surgeons are living painful, desperate, traumatized lives. I understand you're very well remunerated. It's really great to be able to buy a brand new car and to live in a house with a pool. You deserve it. You've earned it. All right. And I would suggest material comforts in the mid and long term are actually unlikely to compensate for the trauma and deprivation that you are experiencing. And in fact, the research statistics bear me out. So my point here that's already come up is, this is me saying this, the system appears to pay you like kings and queens, as it should do, but actually it treats you more like slaves or indentured servants in terms of not belonging to yourselves and not being able to respond to your own needs, especially in the early years of your careers. So it takes a terrible toll. And I'd like to speak to this a little bit now, and then I'm going to move on to constructive steps that is entirely feasible for you to take. All right. So, the research findings have been piling up now. This is an extremely subjective, personal, curated selection of them. But here we go. So some recent research came out just a few months ago. So there's an association of surgeon-patient sex concordance with post-operative outcomes. And this research seems to suggest that women patients who are treated by women surgeons have phenomenally better outcomes than women patients being treated by male surgeons. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to figure out what it is that those women surgeons are doing right. All right, these are the conclusions and relevance here. Suggesting that further work needs to understand the underlying mechanisms. Here's another fairly recent piece of research. So we've got this from 2017, the effects of race and racial concordance on patient-physician communication, a systematic review of the literature. And again, what this tends to point out is that there's all kinds of mixed results, but actually very often, racialized surgeons treating racialized patients, those patients have incredibly better outcomes. And there's other research around as well showing that racialized patients receive significantly lower amounts of painkiller from surgeons, white surgeons following surgery due to historical notions about perceptions of pain sensitivity, which are entirely come out of racism and implicit bias. So there's a whole lot of work that needs to be addressed. And obviously this is causing pain and difficult outcomes more to the patients than to the surgeons, but maybe you'd agree there's a lot here that stands to be addressed within the culture of surgery. Here's another one here. Now, this one really moves me. This is from 2011. So the title is Substance Abuse Among Surgeons, and then after the colon, the perils of losing your credentials. So apparently this is the worst thing, right? Not your life, not the idea of being addicted to some awful substance, but actually the worst thing is that you could lose your credentials. And the astonishing statistics here are that, 13.8% of male surgeons, this is 2011, seem to have a prevalence for alcohol abuse, and a quarter of female surgeons. This tends to support to me this witness I've experienced, which is that it's hell on earth for women surgeons. And, surely there are some things that can be done, especially when we have statistics around telling us how great female surgeons are. This seems like a pretty brutal thing for them to be undergoing. And then here we have another one here. So burnout among American surgeons. This one comes from, where is it? 2001. All right, 2001. So, we've known this for a long time, good 21 years now. We've known that they're very high. The rates still seem to be very high, both American and also Canadian ones, and indeed pretty much across the world. And I'm sure since the pandemic, they've even, popped up again as well. Absolutely horrific research. All right, these many people are burning out. Having experienced myself, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. And then this, very disturbing report that came out in 50 years ago, 1972, right, that the suicide in physicians is very high, and they weren't quite sure why, but they were going to set. There's been lots of research since, but the stats don't seem to be coming down over the years. They still seem to be really bad. So, there's so many questions to ask. All right. And crucially, when I was doing my research here, I actually spoke to a psychotherapist who specializes in treating traumatized physicians. And she told me that the suicide statistics are the worst, of the most acute in women over 55, women surgeons over 45 with 2 or more children. So, maybe we need to ask, how soon can we train surgeons to correct for these, race and gender related biases in their outcomes? What adaptations can be made to support surgeons who are finding their lives blighted by addiction and burnout and, gender prejudice and racial prejudice, and those ones ending in suicide? So I'm really kind of here, I think, to condone some action. The research is ongoing, the research is happening, but we've had 50 years of research already and things are still bad. So I'd like to pass now to actually an invitation to really start changing things up for yourself, for your colleagues, and so forth. All right. So, my proposal is it's really beyond time to change the culture of surgery. And what's exciting at the moment is many aspects of culture, the wider culture, are being challenged, are being spoken to, are being spoken about, and actually are being enabled to shift. Right. So a lot of my work in anti-racism and diversity, equity, inclusion, it does address culture and specifically power and privilege, and how, power and privilege that have been historically held combined systemically to affect different types of people who actually are trying to function within them, usually the people who historically have had less power and privilege, right? And then my point here, and all the research bears me out, is that most often it's the people with the most power and privilege who are the least equipped to determine what changes need to be made, and yet they remain the leaders, right? So this is a paradigm that stands to be examined, addressed, and honestly turned on its head in some way. So from my perspective, I propose there are some aspects of the culture of surgery. It really looks like it's time to address some of the embedded processes, some of the behaviors and values that are tolerated, that are just historically there, and to work to change them for the better. My finding from the SAGES surgery interviews is really clear that many and most physicians evolve their own set of resilient behaviors, so strategies for navigating stress in self-preserving and self-harming ways. But also they're doing this in an ad hoc way, right? And I have spoken with R1s whose strategy following a difficult day in the OR is to go home and drink many beers and to play Grand Theft Auto for hours. This is really not encouraging in terms of people like this, residents like this. Their emotional coping mechanisms are not so developed, and they stand to be supported better in this regard. All right, so I'm here to suggest we need to be more proactive in advocating and training for best practice in self-care around stress and trauma in surgeons. Now what I'd like to do is actually share an extract from a talk by Gabor Mate. He's a Canadian physician. Maybe you've come across him at TEDx talk in Rio. So I'm just going to go to the link here. I might have to shift my share around a little bit. And excuse me, it's going to play some nonsense advertisements. I'll skip over that. And now if I share the screen again with you, hopefully we have to come back. And
I've come to talk to you about addiction, the power of addiction, but also addiction to power. As a medical doctor, I work in Vancouver, Canada, and I've worked with some very, very addicted people.
So I'm going to move on and just come to the key point I'd like him to be saying to you. This is about a 3-minute extract. Here we go.
Life. And if you want to understand addiction, you can't look at what's wrong with the addiction. You have to look at what's right about it. In other words, what is the person getting from the addiction? What are they getting that otherwise they don't have? And what addicts get are relief from pain. What they get is a sense of peace, a sense of control, a sense of calmness, very, very temporarily. And the question is, why are these qualities missing from their lives? What happened to them? If you look at the drugs like heroin, like morphine, like codeine, if you look at cocaine, if you look at alcohol, these are all painkillers. One way or another, they all soothe pain. And that's what the real question in addiction is, not why the addiction, but why the pain. Now, I just finished reading the biography of Keith Richards, the guitarist for the Rolling Stones. And as you probably know, everybody's still surprised that Richards is still alive today, because he was a heavy-duty heroin addict for a long time. And in his biography, he writes that the addiction was all about looking for oblivion, looking for forgetting. He said the contortions that we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours. And I understand that very well myself, because I know that discomfort with myself. I know that discomfort being in my own skin. I know that desire to escape from my own mind. The great British psychiatrist R.D. Lang said that there are three things that people are afraid of. They're afraid of death, of other people, and their own minds. And for a long time in my life, I wanted to distract myself from my own mind because I was afraid to be alone with it. And how would I distract myself? Well, I've never used drugs, but I distracted myself through work and throwing myself into activity. And I've distracted myself through shopping. In my case, for classical compact music, classical compact discs. But I've been a real addict that way. One week I spent $8,000 on the classical compact disc, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help going back to the store. And as a medical doctor, I used to deliver a lot of babies. And once I left a woman in labor in hospital to get a classical piece of music, and I still could have made it back to the store, to the hospital on time. But once you're in the store, you can't leave because there are these evil classical music dealers in the aisles, you know, who, hey, buddy, have you listened to the latest Mozart symphony cycle? You haven't? Well, so I missed the delivery of that baby. And I'd come home and I lied to my wife about it, like any addict, I would lie about it. And I would ignore my own children because of my obsession with work and with music. So I know what that escape from the self is like. And my definition of addiction is any behavior that gives you temporary relief, temporary pleasure, but in the long term causes harm, has some negative consequences, and you can't give it up despite those negative consequences. And from that perspective, you can understand that there's many addictions. Yes, there's the addiction to drugs, but there's also the addiction to consumerism. There's the addiction to sex, to the internet, to shopping, to food.
So I'm just going to pause here, and then I'm going to fast forward a little bit in this talk to another extract, which is slightly shorter, where he makes another point, which I think is worth bringing to your attention here. Here we are.
I've had that same emptiness, not to the same degree as my patients. What happened to me? What happened to me is that I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944 to Jewish parents, just before the Germans occupied Hungary. And you know what happened to the Jewish people in Eastern Europe. And I was 2 months old when the German army moved into Budapest, the Wehrmacht. And the day after they did, my mother phoned the pediatrician and she said, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician said, of course I will come to see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now why? What do babies know about Hitler or genocide or war? Nothing. What we're picking up on is the stresses and the terrors and the depression of our mothers. And that actually shapes the child's brain. And of course, what happens then is I get the message that the world doesn't want me. Because if my mother's not happy around me, she must not want me. Why do I become a workaholic later? Because if they don't want me, at least they're going to need me. Now I'll be an important doctor, and they're going to need me. And that way I can make up for the feeling of not being wanted in the first place. And what does that mean? It means that I'm working all the time. And when I'm not working, I'm consumed by buying music. What message do my kids get? My kids get the same message that they're not wanted. And this is how we pass it on. We pass on the trauma and we pass on the suffering unconsciously from one generation to the next. So obviously there are many.
So I'm going to stop there, and I'll actually, as much as it's tempting to just let the whole thing play, this is really quite an impressive TED talk. People always say, oh, the best TED talk ever, but it really is one of the best TED talks I've ever seen, this one. I'm just going to come back to the full slideshow here. Here we go. So I'm not an expert in addiction. I've been around people who are addicted. I've had family members who had addictive issues. But I'm honestly not sure if I've ever met either a resident or a full surgeon who is not addicted to their work. Mate there is kind of confessing to being addicted to work. But as I say, I see this in many of the physicians I've been supporting and working with over the years. It looks like the workloads of medical students and residents actually condition their dopamine receptors and their production of endorphins to reward them for working harder and longer than is healthy for a happy, well-adjusted human being. To be. So the system is training your bodies and your minds into this kind of a relationship with what you do for the rest of us. And as Gabor Mate suggests, I'm fairly concerned that this addiction, kind of work addiction, it can sort of work as a gateway to other forms of addiction, other forms of self-harming behavior. And the question is, what do we do? How can we protect and support surgeons in having the best possible outcomes for their own lives, right? So I recently asked a physician I was coaching, and I often ask this question to people I'm coaching. If you were giving advice to somebody else in your same situation, what advice would you offer to them? So, what advice would you give to yourself if you were your own patient living a very, very stressful life? And this person responds, and this is often the standard response, to quit my job and take a holiday. But I can't, right? And I totally understand that. And I get it. We're in a period at the moment which people are referring to as the Great Resignation. And many people are changing their jobs, but it's just not that easy for surgeons. You can't just resign and get another one next week. It's a little bit like trying to put the brakes on the Titanic, or, redirect, turn left or turn right, right? Everything around your job is titanic, is huge. And everything you are now is the culmination of years and years of hard work and sweat and experience and negotiation and exams and finally getting to right place and building a reputation, all that kind of stuff. So it's just not possible. It's not as your careers, your jobs and your roles aren't as agile. You don't have the degree of flexibility that the vast majority of professional people do. And I'm pretty sure that this must be one of the conditions that is contributing, unfortunately, to the high levels of poor life quality, the poor life experiences of many physicians. All right. So, oh dear, but there has to be a better way, right? There has to be a way of changing things. It is a time of transition at the moment. There's just the new syllabus, right? The competency by design syllabus has just been instigated, and it's working its way through the system. And it was my pleasure and privilege to be able to contribute a little bit to that when it came in 2018. And my stunned disbelief at that time was to learn that this was the first time the syllabus had been overhauled since 1910. So I understand that usually the rate of change within medicine and within the surgical world is glacially slow. But things are changing at the moment. There is going to be a jolt of a reset following the pandemic, and there is all this cultural change afoot at the moment. So I really feel that if ever there was an opportunity, it was now. It is now. And I came across this rather wonderful quote recently by Ernest Bloch, who suggests that the most tragic form of loss is the loss of the capacity to imagine that things could be different. So, maybe hopefully that, my purpose here is to poke the ant nest a little bit. And it's not an ant nest that I live in. It's just an ant nest that I make small, tiny personal contributions and look at with awe and admiration. But that, wherever you're at in your stress levels or your career, I just invite you to engage with the imagination that things actually could be different. And of course, that we can be hopeful that things can improve, and they can improve quite soon. So now what I'm going to do is come up with run through a bunch of suggestions I have for positive opportunities for positive change that can be affected individually, personally, at the systemic level, at the institutional level, and of course at the personal level, things you can do for yourself. So here come my suggestions. So systemically, obviously, I'd like to say the preface here, it's a very subjective list. It's not a comprehensive one. Comprehensive lists are things that committees come up with. This is just some thoughts I had while preparing this presentation. But there are, I would suggest, and maybe you'd agree with me, there are changes to be made by the colleges and the academies in relation to the stigma that is attached to surgeons seeking support with their mental health, and the threat and the threat this can pose to their licensing and professional reputations, right? We need, historically, historically, people who, said that they were having mental health issues, it was embarrassing. They were a crazed lunatic and they shouldn't be allowed anywhere near an OR, right? And these days, we should recognize that somebody who's saying, I am depressed, I have got addiction stuff going on, is being the most responsible professional we could possibly hope them to be, and that they deserve a degree of time and a degree of support in order to enable them to start living their best life again, and either to return to practice or not. But they shouldn't be a threat to their licensing and professional reputations around that. That needs to be insulated and taken much better care of going forward. Maybe you'd agree this with me. I do understand, again, since the presentation the first time round, that in fact the Royal Academy is it the Royal? I always get the academies and the colleges mixed up, but there is a program afoot to actually address that, and so I encourage you to support it, to contribute to it, because this needs to happen. Last year. Also, I'd suggest that there are aspects of the surgical culture that are fossils of its military origins, such as the toleration of bullying, yelling, putting people down, and of course the very, very tight kind of hierarchy that's in place. There is no consensus around, not very much. So there are some changes to that hierarchy, which is historically a fossil, and it actually doesn't lead to the best decision-making processes. It doesn't enable teamwork, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, there is attention needs to be paid to the ergonomic design of technology and equipment so that it works well with all surgeons' bodies, right? The surgeons' bodies and the bodies that are different heights, different shapes and genders, and that it works as well with the bodies as it does with the bodies of the patients that it's there to treat. So there are leaded aprons that have terrible effects on your backs, I understand, and we're at the point with technological innovation where it should be possible to have an apron that protects you from exposure to X-ray, that actually doesn't destroy your spine if you use it chronic, over time. So here's another one. There just needs to be adjustments made to call and other scheduling that will reduce the amount of chronic sleep deprivation experienced by physicians. I understand it's necessary to work 24-hour shifts, but when you work multiple 24-hour shifts, right, when sleep deprivation becomes chronic, I think the United Nations has stuff about that, about it's actually, and the UN, it's actually a form of torture, and it's recognized in the world as a form of torture, and it's weirdly still tolerated in hospitals. And I know there's been adjustments to what's permitted in the USA that were made some years ago, and there's probably statistics coming out about that now, but there has to be a better way than just putting somebody through the kind of the ritual hazing of being up for days and days at a time without any sleep. Apart from anything else, we know that sleep deprived people make appalling decisions, so it can't be helping the patients either. There has to be a better way. There has to be a teamwork approach there that can be adopted, or something. Again, I don't know all the solutions. I'm just here to call for addressing some of the really, really egregious problems within the systems. So now I'm going to pass to the institutional considerations. It would be really a sensible, good idea to improve communications and the teaching skills of established surgeons. So this means coaching them and training them. So every time I deliver constructive feedback skills to residents, they always, and often several of them, ask me, this is really useful information, this is really helpful skills, when is this going to be taught to the fellows and the attendings and the staff? Because this would be really help us to learn if they were giving us constructive feedback. So I know from them, very regularly that there is work to be done there at the higher levels. Also promoting mentorships. A lot of the surgeons I spoke to with SAGES, actually, I think all of them said their life and career had been improved by having an incredible mentor relationship. So people who mentor well, maybe professors emeritus who still want to contribute. And we can, of course, coach and train people to mentor with more skillfully. It does seem to be that this is a really great way of almost guaranteeing wonderful careers and experiences for many surgeons, that they have somebody to talk to who they can kind of always return to. We also need to provide relationship skills training to medical students and residents. All of the information seems to show that physicians' spouses provide incredible support to them, and that so that if the stresses of training or practice lead to a relationship crisis or unfortunately divorce, then that source of support is absolutely denied, and there's things there thereafter are even more difficult. So given the difficult circumstances that in which you're being called on to work, it makes sense that the hospitals, that the institutions actually provide and offer relationship skills training, right? So my students in theatre, they learn relationship skills through cycling through many of them very quickly at parties. But most medical students, they're not at the party, they're not going to parties because they're home studying, all right? And so there are life skills and interpersonal skills they're not picking up on because they're training so hard in anatomy and all of the other areas. And so because they're missing out on this, I'm pretty sure that, and the research bears me out, this impacts on how they negotiate and sustain relationships going forward. And so this could also be, spoken to, provided to. And also, further along the way, that why not have hospitals offering training in coaching and support skills to the partners and spouses of surgeons? I'm aware that a lot of physicians' spouses are also physicians, but again, then they're co-supporting each other, and coaching skills and communication skills around relationships are absolutely key and crucial, and they can be taught and coached fairly easily and fairly effectively when people just haven't, luckily naturally ended up with those skills. And then, it would be fairly straightforward to make better provision for physician comfort at work. The idea of being a Spartan warrior and sleeping on a tiny pallet of straw and hair blankets, again, that's a kind of historical fossil. Why not have, rooms which are the equivalent of hotel rooms that are provided for people who are working overnight, comfortable sleeping areas, and of course, nourishing, healthy food all the time, and not just when the cafeteria is open. Again, residents have spoken to me about, buying ancient plastic wrapped sandwiches out of a vending machine at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's not okay. They need better. They need better than that. Then other institutional points here. So, we should maybe implement personal development half days for residents. They have academic half days. Why not have personal development ones, maybe every 2 or 3 months, so that they can go and get their teeth fixed, get their tires changed, so they're not using their annual leave for this. We need to recognize and accommodate the needs of physicians who are parents of young children. And there's a pretty straightforward approach to this. Why not get in a focus group of physicians who have birthed parents, birthed children, adopted children, or had children by surrogacy in the last 10 years, find out what would have helped, find out what would have supported them, make a list, and set about instituting that. It would really, really, really help. And again, it seems very often it's the women who take the most burden of raising children, not always, but often. And also we need to enable fathers to be able to parent their children now. Historically, the surgeon would be male and his income would pay the wife and the nanny to take care of the children. There'd be a huge separation there. But we know now that this is not healthy or happy for everybody. And so the system really needs to change. Why not promote peer support networks and buddy systems for the residents? Some of them do it in an ad hoc way, but why not do it systemically and design these peer support networks and actually train them in co-supporting each other in that regard? Why not appoint a surgeon's advocate on the one hand and a resident's advocate on the other, who are actually paid full-time, employed in the system? They would do well-being checks. They would follow up people who have been, surgeons who are experiencing crisis or difficulty, or who have had devastating cases, or just who are returning from parental leave or health leave, right? Someone who would be skilled in noticing and supporting trauma and would be available to support those of you, which is probably all of you at some point or another, who are having these kind of experiences. And then crucially, and everybody kind of laughs when I make this suggestion, but I really think it would help a lot. Why not have a concierge or valet service for physicians in each hospital? One person on a number, on an extension, you can call them. They can take your car and get the tires changed. They can go out and buy some flowers that you're going to present to your partner on the way home. They can go out and buy the birthday present that you've forgotten to get, or, whatever it is, the basic running about, get the keys of your house cut, all of those little life events that most people have the time to attend to, that your life or the overrun of a difficult case might deny. It would just remove a layer of stress and just enable everybody to get on at being really good at what they've been trained to do. So those are a bunch of ideas. And now I'm going to switch to the personal, the daily fixes. So these are things you could do for yourself today, next week, plan to do this ongoing. Really crucially, all right, why not plan for a warm down after you get out of the OR? So actors always warm up to get ready on stage, but actually when they do very emotional scenes, they also have a warm down afterwards, so they can put a kind of a buffer between the emotions of the scene, which are often very real, and then how they are when they go to the bar afterwards, or when they go home to their family. And why not as a surgeon, because surgery is so intense and demanding, why why not plan for a warm down after each one? All right, perhaps a 15-minute walk outdoors, go and look at some trees, or a smart walk where you get a little bit out of breath. Or maybe once you have driven home, once you get out of your car, again, a smart walk and just go and look at some scenery. But before you actually go in and greet your family, really good idea, really helpful. Why not plan to receive an hour of massage or osteo for every 10 or 20 hours, depending on the kind of surgery you do? Again, it's a kind of physical endurance situation that you're spending it in the OR. Or even, why not have a massage center in every hospital? I'm sure the nurses, the respirational technicians, all those kind of respiratory technicians, everybody would benefit just from having a bank of massage around that they could go and visit whenever they felt the need. A practice of yoga, which of course is available online now. If you don't actually go and join a class, you can do it solo in your office or at home, or a set of breathing exercises that you always return to. Again, there's a lot of this online, or some kind of meditation practice or prayer, whatever your cultural affiliations are, daily or frequently. Again, research bears us out. The people who do this actually, reduce their stress and live happier lives. Why not schedule just a few hours of unstructured time each week? Why not put 2 or 3 hours aside? And you don't even need to plan until they're there. And maybe you're just going to have a nap, or maybe you're going to pick up a book and read it, or maybe you'll go and play with your kids, whatever it's going to be. But explicitly put in your schedule and keep these, defend them for yourself. So you actually don't feel that you're kind of tied to your job to the extent that you often are. All right. Crucially, have a date with your partner, or a coffee with a friend once a week, ideally, or once a fortnight if your schedule really doesn't allow. But just some friendship time, just some, chatting about how life is with somebody who loves you, a really good idea. And then maybe just developing obviously a realistic practice. I'm not here to get all kind of, crystal waving or anything at you, but a realistic practice of gratitude, appreciation, the things that you do have in your life, and thinking about those a lot, because it's very easy for us to fall into negativity and all of the difficulties. And just thinking about what is good can help bring some sense of balance back into one's life. All right, now here are some midterm strategies. So you could plan, in the midterm, to cherish, cultivate, improve your intimate relationships. This could include maintenance couple therapy, which I'm always advocating, and I know this from personal experience, and also from the testimony of psychotherapists. I do know that very often people reach for couple therapy when they've already got the number of a divorce lawyer. That actually maintenance couple therapy, going for some support, some therapeutic support for your couple, at the moment you've figured out what your trigger points are, what the recurring arguments are probably going to be, or what the tensions might be, and actually doing work on it before it becomes critical is a really, really, really healthy, good practice to have. And of course, cherishing or cultivating or improving your friendships, identify which are the friends which are good and best for you, and actually, make time for them and pursue activities with them. Really, this is a really good one. So many doctors say, I haven't had a holiday for a while. I didn't plan to take all of your annual leave every year. Even if you haven't booked a flight, you can just have a staycation, but just take all of that time away from the hospital. I really strongly recommend you to do that. Please plan to transform rather than tolerate bad feelings and impossible conditions. Again, you get habituated by the system into just putting up with bad feelings, impossible conditions. These are the conditions that lead you very quickly, like a snake and ladder game, down the snakes into really bad states. So please plan to transform rather than tolerate those crucial, critical things. Perhaps make a list of the stones in your shoe at work, right? An administrator who's impossible to work with, something like that. Come up with a plan to address those specifically, not all together, because that would be an overload, but maybe one a month, one every 2 months, and just gradually pick them off, so that in a year's time, things are going to be much better for you than they are now. And then you can look forward to that as an outcome. Try paying attention every time or whenever you feel annoyed or angry or impatient, right? Because those emotions come up because we have needs that are not being met, right? So instead of just getting carried away by those emotions, try and actually maybe make a note. That time I was annoyed, that time I was frustrated, which needs were not being met, which needs were not being met. This might actually enable you to come back to the point above, the stones in your shoe, and start figuring out how to turn turn things around for your own personal situation. People laugh at this recommendation, but the number of the sages surgeons I spoke to when I said, what are the sources of happiness and fulfillment and contentment outside of work? If they didn't have kids or if they weren't married, they'd say, my dog. Or even if they were, they'd say, my dog. So this is their testimony, not mine, but my personal experience as well. It's an enormous boon to one's life. And, you know, I know you're busy, but you can always find a great dog sitter. There are many of them around. And then here are some other midterm strategies. So you could carry out a kind of happiness or an emotions audit. So note all of your feelings every day for a month, the amplitude of these feelings, you know, by which I mean happiness, sadness, fear, and anxiety, anger, with scores out of 10, right? So actually give them grades, right? Or maybe you're not really feeling anything, and in which case that is really worth noting. It's crucial. So, you know, doing that for a month, then you could plan to review it and then take action accordingly. If you're feeling very little, you might actually be at the depersonalization stage of burnout, and it's especially important that you take some action. Otherwise, just noticing where your emotions are and maybe what the causes of those are is also going to start giving you a roadmap to how to start to turn a few things around for yourself. You know, I strongly recommend regular maintenance personal therapy, couple therapy, yes, and also what we call maintenance therapy. So you don't go to a therapist just because you're having a crisis or you feel it's, you know, you can't deal anymore, but just actually contact with a therapist once every 2 weeks, maybe once a month, just to check in, right, is a really healthy, self-caring choice to make. And just to point out, there are many therapists who specialize in treating physicians. I'm quite happy. I have at least 2 who are very competent and very experienced that I refer people to, and I'm happy to provide that information if anybody should ask. And then, of course, I recommend getting support from a coach with your career and also other life goals. So, and again, there are coaches who specialize in supporting physicians. You know, and as a trained, qualified life coach myself, executive coach, also I benefit from coaching. It's one of the most powerful experiences you can have in life. I've done therapy. It's great. It's very helpful. Coaching is honestly the most life-changing thing of all, which is one of the reasons why I ended up training in it. All right. And then also a very useful practice here, reflect on the colleagues that you may have the most trouble collaborating with. There's always 1 or 2 of them who just make our life difficult. And then maybe, you know, sit down and think about that and then come up with new strategies or different tactics that you could adopt to improve. So how are you going to change yourself in order to work better with them? Because other people probably aren't going to change. People only change when they make a personal decision to do so. So that's another strategy you could maybe think about there. And then, you know, I'd like to speak to longer term strategies, although, you know, basically it's pretty blunt advice, right? That if really things are awful for you, do maybe plan in the longer term to change jobs, responsibilities, institutions, you know, because the Titanic did stop eventually, because things can be turned around. And again, because your long-term happiness and fulfillment is more important than any job. I really do implore you to think about that if that's where you're at right now. So, you know, here's a kind of overview of my recommendations here. I'm just going to take a sip of water maybe while you read them. You know, and sort of feel if I précis this, I'm proposing that we need to change the system. We need to lean in together to change the system, because the long-term outcomes for too many surgeons is just tragic, and we need to consider you as human beings before just treating you as what we use you for, as the service you provide to others. All right, we need to better prepare people for navigating really tough conditions. We need to change the more acceptable aspects of those conditions. We need to learn from the resilient surgeons, the ones who seem to sort of doing pretty well within the difficult systems. We need to remove the conditions that relate to gender, race, and sexuality imbalances that mean that some types of physicians have an even harder time than the other ones. And we actually need to learn from women and racialized physicians and queer physicians too, what they're doing that means that they're having better concordant patient outcomes despite the systemic discrimination they're dealing with. So these are I don't know if this is radical or not. Again, my purpose here is to poke the ant's nest. So finally, I'd like to finish here really with a call to action. So I'll be making these slides will be available on the Surgical Rounds website, as will the Wheel of Life exercise. It will be available there also. So I've usually got 3 proposals here in terms of my call to action. I would like to identify you watching this presentation. I'd like to invite you to identify one thing in terms of systemic or institutional organizational change that's important to you, that could improve the quality of life for yourself or some of your colleagues, and form a strategy for and a commitment to changing it, and maybe really for the rest of your career. There's one thing about the system that you know isn't working, that you're going to do everything in your power, gently and firmly going forward, to change. I invite you maybe to try the Wheel of Life exercise I showed you at the beginning here, so it will be available on the website. Then identify which aspects of your life might be a little bit out of balance, right? Is it a bumpy wheel? Is it a round wheel? Or is it a flat wheel, flat tire? And maybe then form a clear strategy to improve on the, you know, the flatter bits of that in the next week or months. And again, so that you have some optimism about proactively changing stuff rather than just limping along with such an uncomfortable situation in your personal life. And then, of course, maybe adopt at least one of the strategies I've just recommended, especially the personal ones. Try it for at least a month. It takes 3 weeks to adopt or change a habit for a human being. So try any of them for a month and see if it starts working for you. And if it does, I'm delighted. So that's pretty much it. Just to thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. There is a very useful list of support resources here, so I'm not going to read all the way through them, but there they all are. There are a lot of supports available. And again, just to reiterate, there is no shame but pride in recruiting somebody else to support you, given the kind of support and services you are providing to other human beings. So, you know, if you do choose to reach out for some help and support, I salute you in your courage and your commitment to having a happier life, living a happier life. The email to contact me is at the bottom there, in case you should wish to. And then finally, here are the references that I've used, that I've pulled on in this presentation. Thank you again for your attention. Maybe I'll run into you in the corridors one day. I hope I'll be in the corridor and not on the gurney. Thank you very much for your work. Thank you. Bye-bye.